peeps! Andy here, and today I wanted to talk about my favorite horror books that I have read over the past 20 some odd years of me reading horror. I tried to select books that are my favorite books, but also books that fit into other sub-horror genres, so that hopefully if you watch this video all the way through, you will hopefully find a book that you are interested in reading. And if you need even more horror after that, I do have a few short stories linked down below. They're always in the description if you want to listen to those. But let's just start. Here are 10 of my favorite horror books ever written. Plus, at the very end, I'm going to also include my most recent favorite horror book that I've read because it's fantastic. Okay, the first book that I want to talk about today is The Ruins by Scott Smith. I have talked about a lot of these on my channel before, but I wanted to just put everything all into one video so that if anybody's looking for horror book recommendations, they can look in one place. So for each book, I'm going to give a description, but then I'm also going to give a little bit of a reason why it's my favorite book. Let's start with The Ruins. This book is so fantastic. So it's about a group of college students. I think they are just graduating and they're kind of going off on their own journeys to start their adult lives, and this is kind of their last hurrah. So they go to ruins in Mexico to try to find one of the group's brothers that went missing. They end up finding the ruins, but when they touch it, a group of indigenous people that live on the land won't let them leave. So now they have to figure out how to survive on these ruins with very little food and water, how they can potentially get off of it. The reason I love it so much is because this entire book is so visceral, it's so descriptive. You can feel their thirst, you can feel their hunger, you can feel their pain. And not only is it human versus human because the people won't let them off the ruins, but it's also nature versus human because of their surroundings and their circumstances with very little food and water. And then there's also some supernatural elements in there. The ruins aren't exactly all that they seem to be. They seem to move, they seem to listen, they seem to speak themselves. It's a really great, fantastic novel. If you guys have watched the movie The Ruins, it's not a bad movie by any means, but this book I think is a trillion times better. I think it's just such a different experience reading the book than just watching the movie. I want to read you one line. I know I've read this on my channel before, but I have to tell you this one line. So I'm not going to give anything away, but just know that somebody got burned. It says, Eric can hear the flesh burning, a spitting snapping sound. He could smell it too, and was appalled to feel his stomach stirring in response. Not in nausea either, but shockingly, in hunger. Oh, it really makes the reader feel like they're with these characters, like you're on the ruins with them, like you're, dying of thirst and hunger along with them. And the entire time I was reading it, I was thinking, what would I be doing? How would I get out? It just really makes you question your own will to survive. Very interesting novel, fantastic. I really, really do enjoy that one. The next one that I want to talk about is Ray Bradbury's October Country. Ray Bradbury is just a fantastic writer altogether, so kind of any book that you pick up, you can't go wrong with him. But the October Country specifically is very special to me because this book, it almost feels like a Goosebumps anthology in one novel for adults. That's how I would describe this book. It's just little short stories about creepy things, monsters, or vampires or things like that. But I read this every year to get ready for October, and it is the perfect book to get you in the spooky, Halloween-y mood. It's extremely well written, it's very imaginative, it's very descriptive, and it's just fun. It just reminds me of being a kid for some reason, and I don't know why that is, other than the stories do remind me kind of like a Goosebumps or just like a kid scary story. But they're just really, really fun to read, and this book just puts me in the mood for spooky season every year. Highly recommend October Country, especially when we start getting into the fall season. The next one is actually a novella. I know I've talked about this 100 times on this channel, but this is The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, and this is actually the novella that Clive Barker wrote, and then it evolved into Hellraiser, the movie that Clive Barker wrote and directed. So this is where Hellraiser started. If you love Hellraiser, which I do, so if you didn't know, this is the box my husband used to propose to me, so I am a huge Hellraiser fan. If you love Hellraiser the movie, I think that this is just a good companion piece for it, because with most movies and books, they seem to fit together kind of like puzzle pieces, and it's different mediums, so you get different things from each of the art forms. So usually they kind of fit together and complement each other well. So that's why I love this book so much. It's the same story, you know. Frank, he wants more otherworldly pleasures. He opens the puzzle box and is greeted with Cenobites, you know, demons to some, angels to others. It's a fantastic read, and it really does, again, just give you more visceral feelings. There's a great description of when the puzzle box is opened that obviously can't be portrayed in the movie the way it is in the book, but just like how time slows down and his senses are heightened, and it's just really cool. So I highly recommend this, as I do with all of Clive Barker books. If you guys are interested in Hellraiser, I will have a different type of Hellraiser video coming up in a little while, so stay tuned for that. But do highly recommend that one. Quick, easy read, but really worth it. The next one I know some of you will recognize as well. This is Joyce Carol Oates' Zombie. So this is about a young boy named Quentin. Basically, you're reading like his journal entries, and it seems like you're reading the journal of a serial killer. It's very disturbing. I can't even describe how gross this book makes me feel, and that's why I love it so much, because it feels like you're getting a peek into someone's mind you should not be peeking into. It's so disturbing the way that she writes this. And actually, I made a video on this before, a year or two ago, and somebody left a comment that said, oh, it sounds like Jeffrey Dahmer. And then I watched a documentary on Jeffrey Dahmer, and it turns out that she absolutely got some of her inspiration from that, which Joyce Carol Oates does oftentimes draw inspiration from real life events. For sure about Jeffrey Dahmer, but this Quentin, his entire goal is to make these like sex slave zombies because he doesn't really know how to relate to people. So he tries to lobotomize people in order to make them his slaves. Yeah, it's pretty dark, it's pretty twisted. The reason I love it is it makes me feel gross. Horror, to me, should be something that evokes some sort of emotion, and this book does it. This book just makes me feel so gross while reading it. It's so well written. I honestly don't know how she got into the mind of a killer the way that she did, but it really is a fantastic book. And honestly, I don't see a lot of people talking about this, and I read it and I was just blown away by it. So I highly, highly recommend this guy. The next book, we gotta have at least one Stephen King in here, right? This one is Pet Sematary. This is my 90s version of Pet Sematary that is well loved. I have read this book so many times in my lifetime. It's my favorite Stephen King book. And honestly, I mean, I read this in junior high. I read it after high school, and I've always loved it, and it's always been one of my favorites. But I specifically read this book after losing someone that was close to me, and it kind of changed my perspective on how I felt about this book, and kind of just intensified my love for it. So it's a story about a man named Lewis. He moves his family to a new town, and there is a man named Judd who lives across the street who kind of becomes like a father figure to them, and their relationship is just so beautiful throughout the whole story. Lewis finds his daughter's cat has passed away, and Judd reluctantly shows him that there is this place beyond the pet cemetery, this soured land that was an old ancient Indian burial ground that has gone bad. And if you bury things there, they come back to life, but not in the same way that they should. The reason I love this book so much is because apart from, I know that it's like supernatural, there are talk of, I think they call them wendigos, these like people in the forest. But aside from that, honestly, at the base of this, it's just such a heartbreaking story about loss, about grief, about guilt. And when I read it from that perspective, it just changed the way that I experienced the book. It really does just ask the question, like, how far would you go to get back the ones that you love? The reason I love Clive Barker is because he has such an interesting way of juxtaposing beautiful flowery language with gory, horrendous events, and they just fit together so beautifully. And I feel like this is one of the more poetically written Stephen King books. I love the way, again, that like those two things just mesh together. It's so beautifully written. The relationship between Judd and Lewis is so beautiful. The love that the family has is so beautiful, and then like the tragic events and the guilt and the grief that wears them down. It's just all such a convoluted, beautiful, horrible story all rolled into one. I love it. I love it so much. I will continue to read this book because it really is just one of my favorite novels that's ever been written. Next, we're going way back in time. Next, we have Dante's Inferno. It's an old book, but man, is it worth reading. So this is part of Dante's Divine Comedy. It's not like a haha comedy. It's Inferno, Purgatory, Paradise, but we're just talking about Inferno today. Wow, this book is wild. So I love finding where the basis kind of horror began, and this is a horror book if I've ever read one. So this is a story about Dante. He's led through the 9 rings of hell by Virgil, and each ring progressively gets worse and worse and worse until you get to the center. Every time I read Dante's Inferno, I'm like, how does a human brain come up with just this horrendous torment that takes place in this book? I can't even describe how graphic this book is. So it does have a lot of names and history and stuff like that in here. So if you are gonna pick up a book of Dante's Inferno, I would suggest the Portable Dante, because this one has a lot of descriptions of who the people are, who they're talking about. It's an epic poem, so it's read in a different way than you would consume a novel. But I'm telling you, this book is so graphic. It is so dark. And of course there's allegory and there's a lot of metaphor, and you can research and analyze and do all the work. But honestly, just like a basic surface level of a horror book, it's really disturbing. And it's not even like, oh, I killed a man, I'm in hell. It's like, oh, I lied once and now I'm dying in this pit of eternal fire for the rest of my life. The descriptions of torture that are in this book are horrifying. Let me just see if I could find just one. I'm just gonna go to a random page. You will see the river of blood that boils the souls of those who, through their violence, injured others. Let's see what this one is. This is the hymn they gargle in their throats, but cannot sing in words that truly sound. I saw it, I'm sure, that I seemed to see it still, a body with no head that moved along, moving no differently than all the rest. He held his severed head up by its hair. It's fantastic. Again, it's very name heavy, so maybe one with some annotations, some author's notes would be helpful. Now on to the next one. Okay, some of you are gonna roll your eyes, but please just give me a second to just geek out over this book and then make your decisions on if you would read it or not. Okay, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This is a very controversial book. People either absolutely love it or absolutely hate it. There's not really a middle ground. I understand why people don't love it. So it's a story of Patrick Bateman. He's trying to fit in. He's got all the money he needs. He's got everything he needs in life. But he has these, depends on how you read the novel, either murderous tendencies or delusions of murderous tendencies. And the violence in this novel is very intense. If you think the movie is violent, oh buddy, you're in for a roller coaster with this book. The violence is few and far between, but it is 10 times more brutal than the movie is. Here's why people don't like it. It's very monotonous, and it does focus heavily on material objects because it's Patrick Bateman. So there are, 10 pages of just describing suits, or 5 pages of just describing shoes. A lot of just description of stuff that does not matter, but I promise you, every word in this book was meticulously selected by the author. I promise this book is so well written. So just really quickly, the very first line in this book, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Do you know what that quote's from? Dante's Inferno. So basically, he starts out in a hell of his own. So abandon all hope, ye who enters here is the sign before Dante enters hell. So the way that I see The Damnation Gave by Clive Barker as like a Faustian tale, that's how I see this, like a modernized Dante's Inferno, but instead of Dante having Virgil to lead him, it is somebody who is stuck in one of these rings of hell. Because if you pay close enough attention, he starts and ends in the same exact place in the book. It is so well written. I think Bret Easton Ellis is a genius. I can read this book a million times and find things that make even more sense. I have multiple videos on American Psycho, movie versus book, and then I recently did watching every movie Patrick Bateman rented from the video store, which is in this book as well. So I'll leave those 2 videos linked down below, but highly, highly, highly recommend if you guys can get through this book. If you guys are a huge fan of literature and you love finding, similarities in text, it really pains me that people hate this book. I understand it. And in fact, I think the first few times I read this book, I was just like, yeah, it's a good book. But it wasn't until the last year or 2 that I read this that I fell so in love with it, and it has become one of my favorite horror novels ever. That being said, you have been warned, it is quite monotonous at times. The next one that I want to talk about is, again, a novella. This is Who Goes There by John Campbell, and this is actually the novella that the movie The Thing is based off of. I've read this quite a few times, but recently when I read it, I fell even more in love with it again, and it has quickly become one of my favorite stories. So this is definitely a science fiction horror novel, the way that the movie The Thing is. And it is pretty similar actually to the movie, the remake, the 80s version. It's fantastic. It's so fun. The endings are very different, so don't expect going into this to be exactly like the film. But again, I think it's one of those like really cool companion pieces where you get to see where a story began. Same basic idea, stuck in the Antarctic with an alien form that can take the shape of humans. The camp is overrun and chaos ensues from there. Fantastic little novella, quick read, but it's honestly really fun to just, again, like see where things began. So I do highly recommend this guy. If you love The Thing, you will love this book. Again, the endings are quite different. I would say the ending of this is more on the sci-fi scale than the horror scale, but still I think it's a fantastic read. The next one, I don't think I need to give too much of an explanation on, but this is Thomas Harris's The Silence of the Lambs. I love this book so much. I grew up loving the movie, and the book is very similar to the movie. I mean, I think it's a testament to how well this book is written that it just can be pulled and directly put into a different medium and still be amazing. It's about an FBI agent who's training in the academy, and you know, she gets to be put on the case. Hannibal Lecter helps her find this other killer that is out there, James Gumb. It's a great story. It's not one of those books where you read and you're like, that was nothing like the movie. I'm very disappointed, kind of the way that I feel after reading Hannibal, but that's a topic for another day. But this book, honestly, I don't think that you'll regret reading it. When I think of like top tier detective versus bad guy book, I always think of this guy. The reason I love this book so much is because, again, you get a lot more emotion from Starling, but also from Crawford. I feel like you just get to know them more on a personal level than you do in the movie, because in the movie they're like all tough guy FBI agents and they have to be strong and tough. But I think you just get a little bit more of that peek behind the curtains reading the book. The 10th book I don't actually physically have a copy of, but it is Paul Tremblay's A Head Full of Ghosts. I love this book. I love this book so much. It is so fun. It's a story about two sisters. The older sister is exhibiting some strange behaviors that could be psychological or could be possession. And instead of the family focusing on it from a medical standpoint, they monetize off of it instead. So they actually sign a deal to have everything be filmed for like episodes on television. It's such an interesting kind of like new age exorcist type story. It's just a fun story, but it's told through this perspective of the younger sister. So you get to hear all the creepy things that the older sister says and does without the parents around. It's so bizarre, it's so weird, but at the same time, it's very familiar. So everything that happens in the book is like, oh yeah, I've seen this in a possession movie before, or oh, this was directly stolen from The Exorcist. So throughout the whole book, you're like, okay, is she possessed or is this psychological? Is she playing it up for the cameras? You kind of go back and forth, and then the ending comes in, and you're just like, what happened? It is such a wild ride, and I actually borrowed this book from one of my best friends, and at the end we talked about it, and we had very different interpretations of the endings. So I think that's kind of a common theme, at least in the books that I've read from Paul Tremblay, is there is a lot of interpretation for the reader. I love books like that. I love unreliable narrators like we have in American Psycho. I like books that you don't have to necessarily rely on the writer to get the information of what happened at the end. I think it's just a fun way to consume literature, and especially with a book about possession where it could be such a variety of things. It's a really fun book. It's creepy. And it's one of those books where it's been a year or two since I've read it and I still can't stop thinking about it. And for me, that's a good book. That's a good book when it's still on your mind a year or two later and you're like, wait, what did actually happen there? So I definitely want to revisit that one again soon because it was just a fun read. So those are my 10 favorite books. Now let me tell you about the most recent horror novella short story that I've read, because this one messed me up. So this is Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This is kind of a dystopian science fiction horror short story slash novella extravaganza. It is fantastic. It's basically a story about singularity or sentience. A robotic being that's created develops self-awareness. So it kills the human race, but it only has these 5 people alive to just torment for all of eternity. And it keeps them alive, so it's been like 100 and something years that they've just been tortured every day, countless numbers of times in horrific ways by this sentient being. Not only is it that kind of basic story, you know, we've heard before, robots become self-aware and destroy mankind, but the reasoning behind it I think is particularly interesting, because the reason why the robot is so pissed off and keeps them in this kind of perpetual state of purgatory is because it was created by humans and now resides in this perpetual state of purgatory. It's sentient in that it can think, but it's not human. It can't create, it can't wonder, it can't, you know, dream. It's just in this like weird state of existence, and so that's how it takes out its anger on humans. I think this is such a cool concept for a story. It's terrifying to think about, and again, it's one of those stories where it's on your mind all the time, where you're just thinking, man, what would I do if I was alive for over 100 years and this sentient being was just taking horrific action to torment me for all of eternity? That's a terrifying thought. The descriptions are pretty brutal in here. It's just one that stays on your mind. It's a messed up little fun story. So highly recommend this guy as well. Those are my 11 horror books that are the best that I've ever read, that are just always on my mind, that I love for a variety of reasons. I sincerely hope that this video has helped you find some new horror to explore. That's really my goal in life, is just to talk about horror and literature and be able to connect with other people about it. So I really sincerely hope that this video has helped you in some way, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you Sundays and Tuesdays with horror videos. Bye guys!